Hey, Mike and Wendy. Hey back, family. Glad to have a family here with us for this blockbuster adventure. Hey, Robin. All right, guys, we'll give it one more minute. We've still just got a few people trickling in, and then we will get started. Robin, this will be available. A recording will be sent out. A link to a recording will be sent out tomorrow in the follow-up email. All right, guys, we will go ahead and get started. It looks like our attendees have sort of leveled off a little bit. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us. We actually had a huge number of states and countries joining us. We had like about 20 different states and different countries joining us for this program tonight. So we are very excited. I hope you all will sort of join me in welcoming Dr. Jamie Goodall. She is going to be our guest presenter this evening. The VMHC education team has been wanting to do Pirates of the Caribbean for a while, but we just did not feel we could in good faith make that connection to Virginia that we felt like we had to have for movie Mythbusting. And then Dr. Goodall's book came out where she discusses piracy along the Chesapeake Bay. And we immediately knew that that was the link we needed to use this program or to use this movie for the program. So Dr. Jamie Goodall is a staff historian with the U.S. Army Center of Military History. She does just want to be clear that the views expressed in this program are hers, not those of the U.S. Army. But she got her PhD in history from The Ohio State University. And this is her first book. So we will also send a link to that in the follow-up email tomorrow so you guys can learn more and hopefully purchase. I just finished listening to the audiobook, which I believe you narrated. So it was a great journey. We will be doing our usual run of program. Jamie will present for about 30 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience. So feel free to drop them into the chat, drop them into the Q&A, and we will get to them at about 7:30. And with that, I will turn it over to Jamie.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here. What I thought I would do is sort of do a pop quiz style presentation. And so we're going to go through some of the most often talked about stereotypes regarding piracy in the Caribbean, and particularly those that come up in the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. And so if this will go. Oh, we're having technical difficulties already. There we go.
Not the first time.
The Curse of the Black Pearl is the first film, and it was released in 2003. And the film is actually based on Walt Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean attraction at the Disney theme parks. And so our story follows Pirate Jack Sparrow and a blacksmith named Will Turner as they rescue the kidnapped Elizabeth Swan, who's the daughter of the governor, from the cursed crew of the Black Pearl, which is captained by Hector Barbosa. The crew is cursed and become undead skeletons in moonlight. So it's a little supernatural stuff going on there. One of the very first stereotypes or things we think we know about pirates is that they buried their treasure. So what I'd like for you to do is sort of either on a piece of paper, you can sort of keep a tally of how many you get right and how many you get wrong, or you can type your answers in the chat box if you want to engage with other people. But what we see in Pirates of the Caribbean, the film, is that when we find that cursed treasure that Barbosa is after to finally end the curse, it's buried at Isla de Muerta. And so What do you think? Do you think pirates actually buried their treasure or not? I'll give you a second to think about it. So the reality is that pirates did not bury their treasure. This is mostly the imagination of Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island. Now, Captain Kidd claimed that he buried his treasure, but I think that that was more him just trying to cover his behind and save himself from the hangman's noose, if you will. But it didn't make a lot of sense for pirates to bury their treasure. If you think about it, a lot of the things that pirates are stealing are not gold or jewels, and so why would you bury it? And second of all, if you were to bury your treasure, the shifting sands and tides means that you would probably lose it. Either you would forget where it was or it would get washed out to sea. The other issue you run into is if someone else comes across it and steals it from you. And so typically with the goods or the treasure that pirates got, they would go straight to the next shore and spend it, whether that was at a tavern or at an inn. So they're spending their money as quickly as they can. So another very popular stereotype is that pirates made their victims walk the plank. And we see this very clearly in Pirates of the Caribbean when the crew and Barbossa make Elizabeth walk the plank. So what do you think? Do you think that pirates actually made their victims walk the plank or not? So this is actually another fiction for those keeping score. Typically, pirates didn't really do much to harm their victims because if they did, more crews would fight back. If they knew that the pirates were just going to kill them, they would fight back. And so pirates really wanted the least amount of fighting as possible, not only because it preserved their own lives, but because it preserved their weaponry and ammunition. A favorite of pirates, instead of walking the plank, is if they were going to torture you, they would keel haul you, which means they would tie you up with a rope and throw you overboard and drag you along the bottom of the ship. And you would either drown or bleed out. So it was a pretty terrible way to go. Much worse, I think, than walking the plank. But typically, like I said, they didn't torture their victims too often. And you know, the ones we know who did, they were the most vicious and most feared. But really, if they were going to kill you, they would just get it over with. Another very popular stereotype is that pirates wore eye patches and peg legs. So what do you think? This one's really interesting because it's a mix of fact and fiction. There's a rumor that was started, I don't know when, but the idea that pirates wore eye patches as a form of night vision so that they could go above and below deck. As far as we can tell from the historical record, that never happened. It didn't make a lot of sense, to be perfectly honest, because it affected your depth perception. And so you wouldn't have been much use to the crew if you were, you know, doing that. But it doesn't mean that pirates didn't have eye patches or peg legs. In the film, the character Rigetti actually has a wooden eye. And so when he doesn't have his eye, when it's missing, he wears an eye patch. Piracy was very dangerous, and it was not uncommon for pirates to become injured in the midst of a fight. And so an eye patch might be necessary. Now, as far as a peg leg, that's probably a little less common, mostly because if you were injured to that degree, there's no surgeon on board. So the person taking care of you is most likely going to be the cook. And if you're lucky enough to survive that, typically your pirating days are over. And when we talk about the code, we can talk a little bit more about what happened to pirates who were injured on the job, if you will. So another very popular pirate stereotype is that pirates lived by a code or a set of rules. And we see this in the film when Elizabeth invokes parlay, because according to her knowledge, the pirates had a code that they were supposed to abide by. And by invoking parlay, it was supposed to afford her protection. So what do you guys think? Do you think pirates lived by a code or not? And how honorable do you think they were with this code? So this one's actually mostly fact. We do have some surviving records of pirate codes. And from the ones we do have, what we see is that they would lay out everything from whether or not gambling was allowed on board, whether or not drinking excessively was allowed on board. A lot of times they would vote in who was going to be captain, and that person only served as captain during times of conflict. They would even determine whether they were going to mete out workman's comp. So if you were injured during a conflict, they might offer you sort of financial compensation that you could then retire with. It would also lay out the division of loot and where they were going to go and sort of just what everybody's role on the ship was going to be. But this code is really important because not all pirates lived by the code. They were more than happy to steal from each other if necessary. So while you might have had a code for your ship, it didn't mean that there was a code for the entirety of the so-called Brethren of the Coast. So when we think about pirates, we have this idea that pirate crews were all male. You see, this is one of the most famous portraits or images of Blackbeard, and all of the crew represented are male. We tend to see this in a lot of fictional accounts that pirates were all men. But in the Pirates of the Caribbean film, we actually see a female pirate. Zoe Saldana plays Anna Maria, and even though she plays sort of a bit role, the fact is they still had a female pirate, which I found to be very interesting given the historical depictions of pirates and the stereotypes that women were bad luck on ships. So what do you think? Do you think pirate crews were all men or not? So this one's my favorite. It is fiction. We have evidence that women did serve as pirates. Now, more often than not, we have lost these women to history because they were disguised as men, because the stereotype that pirates believed or men believed that women were bad luck on ships was a real sailor's superstition. And so if women wanted to embark on a life of piracy, they had to disguise themselves as men. And so we don't really have a lot of information about the majority of them, but we do have information about a few of the most famous. In terms of the Caribbean, we have Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Now, these two women fought together and served together under Captain Jack Rackham. And it's really unclear whether or not the crew knew that Bonny and Read were women or not, because some accounts say that the women were known to bare their breasts in battle as a means of shocking the opposition. But others, of course, claim that they were so vicious in their fighting that it was well believed that they were men. We do know Captain Jack Rackham, though. He knew that they were women, mostly because Jack Rackham was romantically involved with Anne Bonny, and he got incredibly jealous of her relationship with Mary Read, who some say went by Mark Read. Others argue that she never went by that name. So I'll let you play into that debate. And he uncovered that she was a woman. And so those are sort of the females we know about in the Caribbean. But even shifting outside of the Caribbean, in the South China Seas, Qing Shi is one of the most famous female pirates of all time. She was a sex worker turned pirate whose husband was the pirate king. And when he died, she took over for him. and she managed a fleet of pirates of more than 70,000 men. And so she had a lot of rules about how men were supposed to treat women, and she allowed women on her ships. And so we do have evidence for female pirates, although I think we all wish there was a little bit more information about them. So, of course, we have this idea that pirates talked like, well, pirates, avast and shiver me timbers and blimey and booty and ahoy matey. So what do you think? Do you think pirates talked in this way, or do you think that that is a made up sort of way of speaking? So this is a fiction, and we see this play out in the entirety of the Pirates of the Caribbean film, the ways in which the pirates talk. They sound very different than, say, Commodore Norrington or the governor. But the reality is that pirates would have talked like just any other sailor, really. And pirate crews were known to be multinational and multi-ethnic, so you would have heard a lot of different languages on board pirate ships. So this idea that pirates talked a particular way comes to us again from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, but this time it comes to us from the 1950s film rendition, where Robert Newton took his South Country English accent and exaggerated it for his role as Long John Silver. And so he then took that same accent when he played Blackbeard in another film, and it sort of just became a stereotype from that point forward in film renditions of pirates. So of course, everyone's familiar with the skull and crossbones or the skull and crossed sabers, but the idea that pirates flew the Jolly Roger, how accurate do you think that is? And we see this in the film, of course, with the Black Pearl. It raises the Jolly Roger when it approaches other vessels. So this is a fact. Pirates had their own variations of pirate flags. The moniker comes from the French Jolie Rouge, which meant a red flag. And so some of the earlier pirate flags were actually red, which was supposed to be a manner of, blood and death. But black became very popular among pirates. And each pirate had sort of their own design. So you had the skull and crossbones or the skull and cross sabers. But a lot of the pirates, they had something to deal with death and with time. So there were several pirate flags, for example, that had skeletons on them. So for example, Blackbeard's was a skeleton holding a spear stabbing a heart. Others might have had symbols on it like an hourglass, for example, just meaning you're out of time, give up. And but the Jolly Roger's not the only flag that pirates would fly. What's really interesting is that as a means of tricking the ship they were trying to attack, they might raise false flags, which meant that if they were coming across a Dutch ship, they might raise the Dutch flag to give the indication that they were a friendly ship. And then once they got close enough that that ship couldn't escape, they would then raise the Jolly Roger and be sort of intimidation factor. So false flags and Jolly Roger were very important parts of pirate routines, if you will. So pirates only stole gold and jewels. And we see, of course, in the film, the treasure that is in Isla de Muerta is a ton of gold, a ton of jewels, silver, there are chalices, there's jewelry. That's the idea we have when we think of pirates and what they're stealing. So what do you think? Do you think pirates stole only gold and jewels, or do you think there was something else to it? So this one is a fiction. It was actually very rare for pirates to steal gold and jewels and silver type treasure, mostly because in the Caribbean, the ships that were hauling that kind of goods were Spanish treasure ships. They were coming from South America primarily, but they were very heavily guarded. And it was very difficult to attack one of those ships, particularly because they sailed in convoys. More often than not, pirates are stealing commodities that they can then resell for money. And they're stealing textiles, tobacco, rum, Madeira wine, timber, anything really that they can get their hands on. And they're also well known for stealing parts of the ship. So the sail, the tackle, the rigging and spars, they're more than happy to take that as well, typically because they need to refit their own ships. And it's easier to steal it than it is to buy it. One of the more disturbing aspects of piracy when it comes to the commodities or the things that they would steal is that pirates were very well entrenched in the transatlantic trade in enslaved peoples. And they were just as often taking enslaved peoples and selling them as their sort of merchant counterparts. So this was sort of a dark aspect of piracy. We also have this notion that pirates didn't have families or ties to the land, that they were more often these single men out for adventure, and or those who were down on their luck and needed to make some money. So what do you think? Do you think pirates had families or not? So this is also a fiction. Daphne Giannakopoulos actually wrote a really good book called The Pirate Next Door, I think it is. And she actually researched into pirate families. And the reality is a lot of pirates did have families or some ties to the land, whether that was their own mother and father or siblings or their wife and children. And a lot of times the money that they would earn from pirating, they would send back to their families, or they would come home and invest in land and invest in bettering the lives of their families. A lot of pirates also had connections to land in the form of various merchants or government officials who they colluded with in order to fund their piratical ventures. But we see in the Pirates of the Caribbean film, for example, that none of the individuals had families and that their ties to the land were very loosely based. And really their only connection seemed to be Tortuga. But the reality is, like I said, they have ties everywhere throughout the Caribbean, throughout the colonial North American colonies. So these ties to land were very important to pirates because really, you know, what's the point of stealing all of this and, you know, risking your life if the only thing you have going for you at the end of the day is the tavern? That gets old pretty quick, I feel like. One of the more common stereotypes about pirates, and this comes from the historiography, Marcus Rediker, the Pirate King, if you will, wrote a lot about this in his works. But the idea that pirates were purely democratic, which means they voted on everything together, they contributed equally to the work on the ship as well as the fighting, that captains were really only captain in name. But what do you think? Do you think pirates were purely democratic, or do you think it was a little more complicated than that? So this one's a little complicated, but it's mostly fiction. Now like I said, we do have some pirate codes that do present a very democratic society or an egalitarian society on the ship. But as I mentioned, not all pirates abided by a code. And the other issue is that just by participating in the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples, that automatically makes them non-democratic, in the sense that they clearly had a sense of hierarchy between people, even if their hierarchy looked different than colonial society's hierarchy. So, and of course, everyone's favorite is that pirates drank a lot of rum. What do you think? We see this, of course, in Pirates of the Caribbean when Jack and Elizabeth are stuck on the island and she decides to burn all the rum on the island as a smoke signal. And Jack's like, "Why's the rum gone?" This is a fact. Pirates did drink quite a bit of rum and all manners of alcohol. Part of the issue is that water, especially while out at sea, was not very sanitary and was not always good for consumption. And so they would either drink straight alcohol or they would mix their water with alcohol. And of course, we know that pirates had a propensity for drunkenness on shore, as evidenced by the various arrest records and stories that we have coming from witnesses. So yes, they drank a lot of rum, but they also were very into Madeira wine and gin and beer and mead. So they were not discriminatory when it came to their alcohol. But there were some pirates who were sort of teetotalers who didn't allow alcohol. And one pirate, whose name escapes me at the moment, he actually forbade alcohol on his ship because he believed it led to corruption and violence. And he was well known for enjoying a glass of tea every night. So sort of a gentlemanly pirate, if you will. And then the idea that pirates served no useful purpose for society, that they were just a scourge on the seas and they were detrimental to all of society. What do you think? And we see in the Pirates of the Caribbean film that pirates are not known for presenting their usefulness. In fact, according to the governor, they're very detrimental to the health and well-being of the people of the island. So curious to hear your thoughts. This is also a fiction. Pirates actually were very useful to some aspects of society. It's true that they're stealing from merchants and they are disrupting the traditional capitalistic economy, but on the other hand, they are contributing to what I like to call economies of opportunity, which are those economies that pop up throughout the colonies and in the islands where people are more often than not left out of the economic equation. And so they're able to obtain goods and services they might not otherwise have had access to. It allows for conspicuous consumption by individuals who might have been lower class in society. And pirates were well known for serving as sort of patrols or as security for some of the islands when they were in fear of retaliation. So for example, Jamaica, which was taken from the Spanish by the English in 1655, the governor there used pirates, which he labeled privateers because he gave them a commission, despite the fact that the crown had not authorized him to do so, which technically made them pirates. It gets really complicated. But he used them to protect them from the Spanish who were trying to retake the island. So pirates definitely had their usefulness for various parts of society. And so that's sort of where I'm going to leave it with the myths and stuff. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I will say the chat was like maybe more active than I've ever seen it in a movie class. So everyone having a great time with this topic. I am going to ask Jamie a few questions that came in via email earlier today. So if any of you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat, and we will have a little podcast convo until we're done with the questions for the evening. So I will sort of move us up to the Chesapeake. Imagine that this movie was Pirates of the Chesapeake. What did piracy sort of look like in Virginia comparatively to the Caribbean? Was it similar, just in a different place?
Yeah, I mean, it really was very similar to piracy in the Caribbean in the sense that pirates were stealing what commodities they could get their hands on. So, more often than not, coming out of the Chesapeake, it was tobacco, or they were attacking the ships coming into the Chesapeake. So, they were stealing some of those more luxurious goods that were destined for some of the colonies, particularly the wealthier individuals of the colonies. And a lot of them are pirating during times of conflict, which is very popular in the Caribbean as well. So I would say that it's very similar. It's just a different location.
Was there something sort of about the geography of the Caribbean and the Chesapeake that made them popular for pirates? I've read that they had a lot of islands, so it was just like easy to hide there.
Yeah, and that's what made the Chesapeake so unique was that there may not have been islands per se. There are a few, but that there's a lot of inlets and islets and rivers and stuff that feed into the Chesapeake that made it easy for pirates to navigate because they're using smaller ships than, say, naval squadrons, and it enabled them to escape those people much more easily, or to hide the goods that they were trying to confiscate. So,
But not bury them.
nope, not bury them.
Let's see. We have a question that says Jack Sparrow wasn't a real person, but what was he based on a real person? Are there any sort of famous pirate stories that contributed to how that character was portrayed visually in the movie?
I think I don't know if the directors had a very particular image or not, and they might have mentioned this in some of their interviews. But based on my understanding of Captain Jack Sparrow, he reminds me a lot of a combination between Captain Jack Rackham, who is known as Calico Jack Rackham. He's very colorful and very adventurous and playful. As well as Stead Bonnet, who is the gentleman pirate, just because of how Captain Jack Sparrow behaves with Elizabeth. It's a little more gentlemanly than you would expect from a pirate. And so I like to think he was based on those two pirates.
He is my favorite pirate. And well, Jack Sparrow is based on Keith Richards. If you listen to Johnny Depp talk about where he got the inspiration for the outfits and like how he dressed, which I think is kind of funny. Let's see. Were there pirates in other countries besides Europe and the US? You mentioned China a little bit as well.
Yes. So piracy in the Indian Ocean and the South China Seas was very common. So we had, and then you have, they're not technically pirates, but you have the Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean. But you also, like I said, you have pirates coming out of India, you have pirates coming out of Korea and China and Japan and Vietnam. So all of those places are very active with respect to piracy.
And we had someone ask, how do you become a pirate? Is there like a colonial career day where you're like, I think I want to be a pirate when I grow up, as opposed to like insert other career here?
So there's a couple ways you could become a pirate. One of the more unfortunate ways is that you would get what's called shanghaied, which means that you would be incredibly drunk and you would be kidnapped. The other is that a captain or an individual who wanted to put together a pirate crew might go to the local tavern and see if anybody was interested. And so you would just sort of sign up that way. The other is that you would be conscripted. If your ship was attacked, they might take you and force you into pirating. So there's a few different ways that you could become a pirate.
In the movie, we see the British government is like very anti-pirate. They're like, we are not working with these pirates. Like we are branding pirates. We are hanging pirates. In reality, I feel that colonial governments had a little bit of a murkier relationship with pirates. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so during the golden age of piracy, which is about 1650 to 1720, 1730-ish, colonial governors were well known for colluding with pirates. Now, by this point, the crown itself is not necessarily condoning piracy the way that it did during the Elizabethan era, but it's still sort of looking the other way and allowing its colonial governors to collude in various ways. But by the time we get to the 1720s, 1730s, which I think is sort of roughly the time period of Pirates of the Caribbean, is sort of in that later stage, you do see an excessive amount of hangings and prosecutions of pirates, just because by that point, there's more of an international cooperative effort to stamp out piracy. And so England really had to take it seriously by that point.
So if this movie had been set maybe like 50, 70 years earlier, Jack Sparrow might have had like written permission to do some stuff.
Absolutely. Yes.
Very cool. All right, let's see. We have, a question about sea shanties. Do we have records of pirate music and poetry? How'd they pass their time on those boats?
So I forgot her name now, but there's a sea shanty expert who talks a lot about how there's a difference between sea songs, which we typically hear and think of as shanties, and actual sea shanties. And that is that shanties are more work songs. They're beat driven to make work go by a little bit faster. And they have their roots in traditional African songs that they would use to work the fields. And so I think that pirates had shanties. There's even records in one of the pirate codes we have where one of the pirate captains allowed for a musician on board to help the men pass the time. So it would not have been uncommon to hear some songs, whether they're sea songs or sea shanties, on board pirate ships.
What about pets? We see monkeys and parrots.
Yeah, so that would have been less likely, mostly because having a pet means one more mouth to feed. It's something to keep care of and clean up after. So you didn't really want to spend your time doing that. And the other issue is that the types of pets that we see more often in the stereotypes are, like you said, monkeys or parrots. Those are very exotic animals at the time. I mean, even today, we still consider them exotic animals. And they were very valuable. So it would be more likely that you would capture those animals and then sell them as opposed to keeping them as a pet.
That makes sense. Someone just popped up and said, but what about cats? Were there mice on board that they would have kept like cats for?
They may have. I don't have evidence for it, but it would make sense because, yes, they had a lot of mice and rats on board ships. Unfortunately, not the cleanest places to live.
You know, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of brains. Let's see, where did Pirates of the Chesapeake tend to resell their goods? Were they just operating along the East Coast? Did they go down to like Louisiana? Did they go across the Atlantic?
So most of the pirates who operated in the Chesapeake would just resell their goods in the Chesapeake, or they would venture, they might venture out to the Caribbean. John James was known for heading out into the Caribbean to sell his goods. And there was also really great connections with New York. New York was sort of a pirate haven, and that's going to be sort of the subject of my next book. And so there was a clear connection between the merchants of New York and the pirates that operated from the mid-Atlantic through the Chesapeake.
You mentioned a little bit about slavery and the buying and selling of enslaved peoples, which I'm so glad you brought up. I think it would be remiss to talk about colonial anything in North America without talking about that. Did the pirates themselves engage in slavery and have enslaved pirates, or were they sort of more just transporting enslaved peoples?
A little bit of both. There were some pirates who are known to have kept enslaved Black men on board to serve the ship. Now, we do have evidence that some pirates did release enslaved Black men and women, and that they allowed Black men to join the crew willingly. But that's actually quite rare. So more often than not, they're engaged in the selling and the enslaving of Africans, as opposed to enabling them and allowing them on their ships.
And I mean, some of you might even be familiar with the fact that the first enslaved Africans in Virginia who were brought over here were sort of intercepted by pirates or privateers, merchants, but taken off of the original vessel and then rerouted and brought to Virginia. So, I mean, it sort of has its roots very early in the Virginia colony as well. Let's see. Oh, when did piracy in the Chesapeake end? Your book goes up to the Oyster Wars.
Yes.
And does that really sort of mark the end of official piracy in the Chesapeake?
Sort of. Some would argue that the Oyster Wars are still going on in some respects.
The Maryland Virginia Wars will never end.
Yeah. When I gave a presentation about the Oyster Wars, there was a gentleman whose family was the victim of oyster pirating. And so he had a lot of very interesting stories. But my book goes up to 1959, which sort of marks the end of the official so-called Oyster Wars. And that's with the death of a man named Berkeley Muse. He and his friend, Mr. King, were out. They supposedly had had a few drinks and decided it would be a great night to go fishing for some oysters. They didn't have a license, and so technically they were pirating them. But the sheer violence of the police force, the natural resources police force, was overwhelming. And when they supposedly were supposed to just fire a few warning shots, they ended up with a barrage of bullets at the ship, and they killed Berkeley and injured Mr. King. And so with that, they called for the disbanding of the oyster police force, and it sort of put an end to the overall official oyster wars. So
I remember learning about the Oyster Wars for the first time and like the piracy of the Oyster Wars, but not realizing when I first learned about it that it was like in the mid 20th century, and then being sort of mind blown by that like juxtaposition of pirates and the mid 20th century. Because when I think about it, I do think about like the 1600s and the 1700s,
yes.
Not the 1900s. Let's see. Okay, let's move on to one of our most famous pirates, Blackbeard.
Yes.
We have actually a fairly strong connection to him in the collection here. We have Governor Alexander Spotswood's like decree to go find and kill Blackbeard. So can you tell us a little bit more about him, his connections to Virginia, how he got his nickname?
Yeah.
Run down with him, I guess.
So Blackbeard, whose original name was Edward Teach or Edward Thatch, depending on which record you're looking at, he got his nickname because he had this big, glorious, menacing black beard that he would often allegedly tie lit fuses into to make himself appear even more menacing. And he primarily operated out of North Carolina and out of the Carolinas, but he was well known for traveling into Virginia waters as a means to escape the Carolinas coastal sailors. And he often used the Chesapeake as a place to refit his ship and to sell some of the goods that he had stolen when he couldn't do that in the Carolinas.
See, and Haley actually just asked if she could screen share. We have a print of him in our collection where his like beard is on fire. So she's going to screen share so you guys can all see that. And then I have another question about the diet of pirates. Oh, there you are. Did they travel as citrus to get rid of scurvy, or did they just deal with it?
Yeah, so it was not uncommon for them to travel with citrus to prevent scurvy. And citrus goes really well in various types of alcohol, so it just worked out for them. But as far as their typical diet, it would have been just like any other sailors. It would have been pretty poor, poor rations, a lot of dried meats, anything that would be sort of shelf stable on board the ship. So many pirate ships had a cook, so they would have a few hot meals here and there, but because they're at sea for so long at various points, if they didn't keep things that were relatively shelf stable, they would just spoil, and so it was no good to them. And the less stuff they carried, the better, because it left more space open for the things they would steal.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Oh, we had a question from a student, actually, which I think is very cool. What are some Pirate 101 sources you would recommend? Obviously, there's like a lot of fantastical pirate stories, but where are some good places to look for some truer facts?
So one of the places that I like to go to, because it's freely available online and all the records are transcribed, is the Calendar of State Papers from British History Online. And the Calendar of State Papers is searchable. So you can search the various spellings of pirate and come up with thousands upon thousands of hits of government correspondences. And so it's more often letters from governors, memos from the crown. So it's more official documentation. And then E.T. Fox has a really good book out called Pirates in Their Own Words, which compiles and transcribes some of the colonial office records and the admiralty records and pirate trial transcripts that you can access. So those are the ones that are easily accessible. As far as other sources, the Captain Charles Johnson, A General History of Pirates, is a great book to go to just for a very broad overview, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because there's a lot of fiction within the book. Some of the information we can corroborate with other sources, but a lot of it is exaggerated or completely made up. So you have to be careful with that one. But as far as records I used, the colonial office records and the admiralty records in England and the Netherlands were very important for me. And also the Bermuda State Papers, which I believe the Bermuda Papers, if I'm not mistaken, I have bound volumes of those. So I think that those are available to purchase if you want to drop a pretty penny. So there's lots of different resources out there that you can access that you don't necessarily have to pay for, though.
When you are talking about like these trial papers and things like that, is that sort of like, is that the end of the road for most pirates? Like, did they go until they were caught, or did some of them sort of like, could you bow out of piracy and like go back to live a respectable life?
Yeah, more often than not, that was the case. They might pirate for one or two ventures, but the life was so difficult and dangerous that, beyond that, most pirates didn't sail many more ventures than that. Of course, we have the evidence of those like Blackbeard who made many adventures, but the typical pirate, one or two ventures, and they were retiring with the money that they had earned. Yeah.
Just like a little side hustle before they got there. All right, guys. Well, we have just one more question. So if you have anything that I missed or didn't get answered or, got sort of lost back in the chat, please feel free to drop it. But if not, I will end with how did you get interested in this topic? And do you have any favorite pirates?
Okay, so I had never actually thought about pirates when I was growing up. It was not something that like I read a lot about or, played pirates as a kid or anything like that. I was too busy playing Sailor Moon and other sorts of weird things. But in graduate school, I took a European imperialism course. And one of the things we had to do was write a final paper on some aspect of European imperialism. And I had come across a quote which compared Sir Francis Drake and Sir Henry Morgan and basically called Morgan England's second Drake, which I thought was kind of a misnomer, really, because I felt like Morgan was a man on his own. Like he didn't deserve to be titled the second Drake. I felt he was what he was. And so I wrote a paper about that. And that's the paper I used for my PhD program applications. And so when I got accepted to the Ohio State, the woman who would become my advisor asked me if I was interested in turning it into a dissertation and studying pirates more broadly. And I was like,
yeah,
yes, why not? And as far as my favorite pirate, Stead Bonnet or Steed Bonnet, however you say it, he's my absolute favorite just because he's the worst pirate on the planet. He was a gentleman from Barbados, I think, and he had a very profitable business. He was married, he had children, and he just woke up one day, sold his business, ditched his wife, bought a ship, paid for a crew, decided to go pirating, somehow ended up with Blackbeard for a little bit until Blackbeard realized he was absolutely terrible and locked him in his cabin. Eventually, Blackbeard ditched him as well. And it just, things don't go well for Stede Bonnet. But I just love that he had this sort of midlife crisis and decided pirating is what I'm going to do.
He didn't buy a Corvette, he bought a pirate ship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Let's see. All right. What else are you working on? What would you like to plug? Tell people all of your things that you're working on these days.
Okay, so available right now is Pirates of the Chesapeake Bay from the colonial era to the Oyster Wars. You can find it on Amazon or use IndieBound if you want to support local indie bookstores, or you can buy it direct from the History Press. I also just recently published a bookazine with National Geographic called Pirates, Shipwrecks, Their Conquests, and Lasting Legacy, I think is what it was. And so that's out in grocery stores and Walmart and Target and bookstores and stuff, or you can find it on Amazon as well. And then what I'm working on right now, which doesn't have a title yet, is Pirates of the Mid-Atlantic, which is focusing on New York and Pennsylvania, but with a little bit of New Jersey and Delaware thrown in there.
Wonderful. All right. And then final last question that just popped up. Once everyone has finished reading your book and all of these wonderful things, who are your favorite fellow pirate historian writers?
Yes, I love this question. So Dr. Rebecca Simon, she has a book out called Why We Love Pirates. It just came out this year or last year. Mark Hanna, Pirate's Nests, very good book. He's a big hero of mine. If you're going old school, Marcus Rediker, you can't go wrong with any of his books. So Villains of All Nations, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, or The Many-Headed Hydra. And then if you're looking for a more Indo-Atlantic, like looking at the Indian Ocean side of things, Kevin McDonald's book, which the name escapes me right now, but Kevin P. McDonald, his book on pirates is really good as well.
Wonderful. All right, guys. Well, we will send out a lot of those resources in the follow-up email. We will send out Jamie's website. We will send out some pictures of Blackbeard and the recording. So you will be hearing from us at some point tomorrow. But thank you all so much for joining us on this lovely spring night. And with that, we will turn our cameras off and bid you guys ahoy. That's only for hello. So goodbye.